a very good morning and welcome you all to uh, a workshop, a seminar, rather a seminar on the rights of migrant workers amid COVID-19, which is being organized by the Working Group for an ASEAN Human Rights Mechanism with support of FNF. And we are quite, privileged to have four speakers with us all together, including a reactor, a discussant, which is a member of our working group for an ASEAN Human Rights Mechanism. Before I introduce our speakers, just like to first of all introduce myself. My name is Siprapha Petmisi, and I am working at the Institute of Human Rights and Peace Studies, Mahidol University. I am serving you today on capacity of the co-chair of the working group for an ASEAN Human Rights Mechanism, something that I have been volunteering with during the past 23 years by now. I would like to mention that this particular issue that we brings up to the discussion today has been, of course, in our mind for quite some time, looking at the situation of COVID-19 pandemic and disproportionate impacts on some groups of people in our societies in South Asia, especially in this case, the migrant workers. And I just want to maybe point it out two things. One is that, of course, the migrant workers, protection of migrant workers, are not only, include in the two documents already adopted by ASEAN, and that these documents are the ASEAN Declaration on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers. Another one adopted in 2017, the ASEAN Consensus again, on the protection of migrant workers. But importantly, I could not to mention about another document, which is the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, a overarching document adopted by AICHR by ASEAN in 2012. In the preamble, Article 4 mentioned about the protection and promotion of the rights of women, children, the elderly, person with disabilities, migrant workers, and vulnerable and marginalized groups. So their rights are recognized there, and it's considered as inalienable, integral, and indivisible part of human rights and fundamental freedoms. So as I mentioned, these three documents pointed out very clearly that migrant workers are, people, and their rights are recognized by all ASEAN member states. Actually, certified, adopted by the leaders of ASEAN in 2012, as I mentioned. The second one that I just like to mention here about the recent, situation of pandemic. According to my own research, I'm currently writing a paper, and we understand that at least my statistic might not be that updated because it was dated back to June, but I checked again a few days ago that of course, ASEAN now accounts for almost 200,000 cases already. And we know that about 95%, Brema, my good friend, would be would be talking about that later. But in one country, about 95% or more than 90% of COVID-19 infected are among migrant workers. And if you look at its current situation in Thailand, especially along the Thai-Myanmar border, when there is the second wave of COVID-19 infected in our neighboring country. Thailand is now restricting the borders or restricting of I would say that many provinces along the Myanmar and Thai borders are now are now closing the borders. In some places, barbed wire is being put because in order to prevent the people from our neighboring country to enter into Thai borders for fear of the spread of pandemic. And I think this situation is going on during the past at least 2 weeks already. So these are just a few things that I just like to mention. And the questions here actually, first of all, how every single state hosting migrant workers would be able to, extend the protection of the rights of migrant workers. The second one is actually about how the ASEAN Human Rights Mechanism, in this case AICHR and ACWC, the ASEAN Inter-governmental Commission on Human Rights and the ASEAN Commission on the Protection of the Rights of Women and Children, how could they protect and promote the rights of migrant workers, and if they could not do it properly, why so, and how to deal with this kind of issues. So these are something that we are going to discuss today, as I said, with the four speakers. The first speaker in my list is Director Levison Akaltara. Uh, 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 Director Levison Akaltara is Director of the Pre-Employment Services Office of the Philippines Overseas Employment Administration of POEA. He has been in the public service since 1993, mostly at the Department of Labor and Employment in policy support. He made the rounds on workers welfare, labor relations, and employment as fields of specialization before delving into labor migration, overseas employment with his transfer to POEA since 2013. So he is of course, the right person to talk about it, especially when it comes to Filipinos migrant workers working in other countries. The second speaker is Dr. Sakibin Zakaria. Dr. Sakibin Zakaria is currently Under Secretary of the International Division of the Ministry of Human Resources of Malaysia. Um, his career started in 2001 as the Assistant Director of the Intra Division in the Implementation and Coordination Unit, Prime Minister's Department, before um, uh, he moved to the Social Division by CU, and he I may not be going through everything that I have here, but just to say that he joined the Ministry of Human Resources of Malaysia in 2019, especially after his completion the completion of his study for his PhD. The third speaker, and I'm sorry that I did not do this in order in terms of gender, but we have a really very gender balance here in our panel. The third speaker is Miss Yuyun Wayuningram. Um, I'm sorry that I usually call just her name Yuyun only because we know each other for so many years. Yuyun is currently not only the representative of Indonesia to the ASEAN Inter-governmental Commission on Human Rights, uh, actually took up this position last year, 2019. She is also a PhD candidate at the ISS in the Netherlands. She was actually, I just want to mention a few things here that before she got into AICHR, she was the team leader of the regional EU ASEAN dialogue instrument on human rights facilities to support human rights work of AICHR and other human rights bodies within ASEAN. And although she is still young, but she has spent more than 22 years working in human rights organizations at national, regional, and international level, including Human Rights Working Group based in Jakarta from Asia and many others. Last but not least, will be the reactor, Ms. Brema Marti. Brema, again, I call her by name. She's a very good friend of mine, member of the working group, as I mentioned. She's currently secretary of Maruwa. Brema is currently visiting senior research fellow at the Penang Institute in Malaysia, and she has worked in different capacity as teacher, journalist, researcher, director, and she was also one time appointed to the Singaporean Parliament. And of course, she has been leading. She has founded quite a number of organizations in Singapore. Uh, uh, to to start with, may I invite Director Levison Akaltara from the Philippines to speak, and I was instructed by my team, who is working behind, that each speaker will be having 15 minutes, and I am known for a very strict timekeeper. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Sriprava. I'll delve right into my presentation. This presentation, of course, is coming from a perspective of the Philippines, which is an ASEAN member state and is also a labor sending country worldwide. The title of my presentation is Impact of COVID-19 on the Rights of Migrant Workers in ASEAN, Experience from the Philippines. Next slide, please. I'd go right into the immediate impacts that we are seeing right now as the events unfold during the pandemic. The Philippines actually has 2 million plus deployment of overseas Filipino workers or labor migrants for each year. But and a lot of that is from our new hires or those that are going out of the country for reasons of work for the first time or are entering into a new contract with their employers. And our most recent statistics from January to August 2020 generally tells us that about 25% of those who are leaving for work have been delayed or have not actually been able to go to their employers due to the pandemic. So for us, that's an employment opportunity delayed. On the screen is our breakdown for worldwide statistics as well as those that we have selected for ASEAN countries. Mostly affected is Singapore and Malaysia. Um, but you can imagine the magnitude of this effect on our traditional labor market destinations for our overseas Filipino workers. There could be so much more than that. Next slide, please. Um, we're also seeing immediate impact on welfare cases on the job sites as they continue to mount day by day. This is yesterday's statistics as of 17 September. And as you can see, our traditional labor markets in the Middle East are registering the most numbers of workers who wish to be assisted in terms of repatriation, and in terms of support as they are losing man hours on the job. And there are also those who are stranded, caught between going home or wanting to go to work but could not be at work. The same slide is reflected on the next one. A similar slide for other countries is on the next slide, I should say. Next slide, please. And that's actually summarized in the next slide. I believe our organizers will be sharing some of these presentations after this forum. But in terms of this displacement, we're seeing very much a huge share in the Middle East, and then in the European and American markets, labor markets, then the Asia and the Pacific region where ASEAN belongs. Next slide. Um, in the light of all of these immediate impacts that we are seeing, not to discount, of course, the long-term and the medium-term impacts that we will be seeing as structural adjustments as well as employment flexibilities will be put in place by countries of labor destinations. What do we have for guidance in the ASEAN neighborhood? So next slide. Of course, we do have the ASEAN Declaration on the protection and promotion of migrant workers' rights. And this was, next slide, please. This regional framework is an initiative to promote rights of migrant workers. It outlines obligations of sending and receiving countries to migrant workers in the region, and it manifests commitment of ASEAN to protect and promote their rights. It's a landmark document which is first a specific recognition of the rights of migrant workers in the ASEAN region, and it is also a developmental instrument as it calls for one that will make it a truly living document that will implement the ASEAN Declaration. So next slide, please. The consensus was signed in November 2017 here in Manila, Philippines. It has come full circle after the declaration. The ASEAN consensus was signed a decade after. As you can see, the photo features our ASEAN member state leaders in the 31st ASEAN Summit here in Manila after the signing. Next slide, please. So the regional framework actually outlines the points, historical points, but mainly our consensus recognizes the fundamental rights of migrant workers and their family members in accordance with national laws and policies of ASEAN member states. And it also recognizes the specific rights of migrant workers within the context of those national laws and policies. Next slide. Next slide, please. Am I seeing the right slide already? Okay. The nature of the ASEAN consensus is that while it is non-legally binding, um, the ASEAN consensus highlights the unanimity and undivided commitment of ASEAN member states to protect, and promote the rights of migrant workers in ASEAN. It is binding to the extent that AMS, through the ASEAN Committee on Migrant Workers, ACMW, will, among other things, develop an action plan to implement the ASEAN consensus. Next slide. Report and review the progress of implementation of the ASEAN consensus and its action plan. So the reporting and sharing of information sort of prods and keeps us each other on our toes. And the sharing of best practices, including those from existing bilateral engagements, are also required to be highlighted within this framework. So the non-legally binding nature of the consensus acknowledges that it is a living, evolving document, which means the review mechanism under the ACMW will provide opportunities for improvement with respect to the provisions and the other legal nature of the consensus. Next slide. There's a question here on whether amendments may be done on the consensus. Yes, any AMS may propose amendments to the consensus, and the proposed amendments shall be submitted to the ASEAN Coordinating Council by consensus the ASEAN Summit for decision. So big events such as the COVID-19 pandemic might be an impetus for amendments of the ASEAN consensus. And should there be any suggestions towards that direction, I think it can be done at, at points starting from these developing circumstances under the pandemic. Ways forward, next slide. After the signing of the ASEAN consensus is development of an action plan, which is being done already. And it will be incorporated in the ACMW work plan. Next slide, please. So far, what we have been doing to cope with the pandemic, and as you know, governments right now have a hard task of balancing employment opportunities for their citizens as well as protecting their rights and keeping them out of harm's way in the wake of the pandemic. So there are short-term, immediate responses in terms of policy and program, but there are also ways that we are looking forward to do it in the medium and the long term. Some of these are those things. Some of those are these things. Implementation of employment standards through the employment contract. We're trying to balance labor flexibilities that are in the employment contracts that are signed, which, as we now see, there are reduced working hours, there might be reduced wages, there might be provisions that are hard to implement, such as health insurance, limited access to testing and treatment for COVID, repatriation costs, among others. And as we workers fall through the cracks of standards, there are dispute settlements that need to be attended to, and these mechanisms are tested through time when the pandemic has set in, because there's a restricted or limited movement of both the workers, government personnel in the host country to settle these disputes arising. On-site welfare assistance. There's also restricted or limited movement of both the workers and our people on the ground, but the policies actually highlight our need for more people on the ground that can respond to the needs of our workers on site, especially during these times. And it has proven that labor market information sharing is crucial during this time. And the POEA, as well as the Department of Labor and Employment, has been issuing since March this year labor advisories on a daily basis on the changing labor market landscapes globally. So whether there are restrictions, whether there are bans, or whether these bans are lifted across the world, we do advisories for our public. And of course, we're still looking at the bilateral labor agreements as ways to facilitate either the movement of going to or coming home during the pandemic. And we're relying on the provisions of these bilateral labor agreements to respect as much human rights as possible, even while the safety as well as the security of everyone is being taken into account. Next slide. We also have other mitigating measures, costs of repatriation, costs of testing and hospitalization, enforcement of policies that recruitment agencies shoulder repatriation. All of these are being done through dialogues. Financial assistance of affected Filipino migrant workers, as we have seen in earlier slides, those are the statistics that are actually seeking for help from our department. And the Department of Labor and Employment has come up with an assistance package for our workers who have been affected by the crisis. Um, it's called the Dole AKAP program. AKAP in Filipino actually means embrace. So this is our way of hugging our workers during hard times. Um, Funds are fast depleted, so we're seeking for the blessing of our Congress to reallocate appropriations to respond to the needs of our workers on site. Of course, there's continuing development of policies such as guidelines on the deployment of Filipino migrant workers amid COVID-19. We've approved the green lanes for our seafarers, which assures unimpeded movement for those who are healthy and secure to leave the country as seafarers. And we're coming up with a set of special guidelines for our land-based workers as well. We're also working with other government entities and private sector partners in the redeployment of displaced Filipino migrant workers, whether for overseas employment or local employment. And then, of course, we will soon be rolling out an overseas employment adjustment and recovery plan for the entire overseas employment sector. Um, do I still have more? Next slide. Of course, while we are doing these immediate steps, we do have some Philippine suggestions to our friends in ASEAN. Perhaps we ought to think about providing support as a community for the livelihood and health of all workers and ensure that their labor rights are being respected amid the impact of COVID-19. Um, Maybe we should also explore requesting employers to compensate appropriately their workers, including migrant workers who are laid off or furloughed during the pandemic. Uh, Perhaps provision of social assistance and unemployment benefits to all workers affected by pandemic in accordance with laws, regulations, and policies of each ASEAN member state. And this is my last slide, I think. Effectively implement the ASEAN consensus, particularly the provisions pertaining to employment or working conditions, those that are concerned with the health and safety and movement to reunite with their families. And of course, encourage more social dialogues in the area of occupational safety and health, as well as social protection. Um, and of course, in developing effective labor market policies that can save lives, jobs, and businesses amid the pandemic. That's all for my presentation. Maraming salamat po. Thank you so much for your attention. Good day to everyone.
Thank you so much, indeed, for your kind sharing. I think there are a few things that I just like to pick up. One, of course, we can see clearly, some serious impacts on migrant workers because of this COVID-19. For example, already the delay of overseas employment. Secondly, we have, as I mentioned at the very beginning, and you elaborate further, the regional frameworks. And unfortunately, the legal frameworks that we have, they are not legally binding. But for me, as a political scientist, these non legally binding documents actually express very clear political commitments of ASEAN member states, which of course the reflection of the ASEAN itself. And I feel that because, for example, the ASEAN consensus, it provides for amendment. That you already mentioned. And I think this is something that ASEAN human rights bodies like AICHR should consider. The third one, which is actually very important, is I am not talking about national um, um, national treatment. But of course, migrant workers, their rights, as I said, are recognized and should be protected. So not only rights to health service, to livelihood, should be respected and protected, but they should also benefit something the assistance scheme which are being provided by different governments as well. Well, unfortunately, yeah, that's not the case. For example, in Thailand, the Thai citizens are benefiting the assistance scheme being provided by the Thai government, but this completely exclude migrant workers who are still remaining in on the Thai soil. Thank you very much also for your timing. You spent 16 minutes. So our next speaker, Dr. Zaki Zakaria, microphone is yours, please.
Thank you, Madam. Okay, thank you, Madam Moderator. I would like to start with the statement that Malaysia believes labour migration is one of the key toward economic development of our country. And in fact, labour migration also contribute to the rejuvenation of our workforce. Next slide. Okay, as we know that COVID-19 pandemic is what you call the unprecedented situation that has globally affected the economic landscape and the labour market. Within Malaysia labour landscape, the main issues we can see the massive impact in terms of increasing number of retrenchment. Therefore, it affects the livelihood, jobs, and income of all workers, including migrant workers. In Malaysia, certain sectors that badly affected are manufacturing, construction, airline, and tourism industry. Malaysia is unique in a way that we have millions of documented and undocumented migrant workers. For instance, I would like to share in 2019, the World Bank estimated the number of undocumented migrant workers is between 1.23 million to 1.456 million. But some sources said the numbers might be more, around 2 to 2.5 million migrant workers. So this portray, or we call it pose another huge challenges to Malaysia in form of influx of migrant workers. Malaysia plan to cap the number of foreign workers of not more than 15%, where we have around, currently we have around 15.3 million. So the number of foreign workers should be around 2.3 million. But the situation in Malaysia is quite unique. That I mentioned earlier that we might have more than that. Some claim that the number of migrant workers might be estimated between 4 to 5 million workers. Next slide. Migrant workers are normally associated with unskilled workers, in saying that they are primarily employed in 3D activities, or we can define as dirty, dangerous, and difficult. Majority of migrant workers in Malaysia work in plantation, construction, agriculture, manufacturing, and service sectors. Although priority is given to Malaysian workers, the right of all workers, be it local or foreign, are guaranteed under the existing laws and regulations. For example, the Employment Act 1955 and minimum wage order, where every employee is either local or foreign, they are entitled to get the minimum wage as imposed. And this year, starting 1st September, we have implemented what you call Act 446 on minimum standard of housing and amenities, where employers are subject to provide what you call a good working condition to all employees, especially foreign workers. Next. Okay, there are some of the issues regarding migrant workers in Malaysia. Even though government, actually when the COVID-19 pandemic have put much pressure to the government. So the priority are given to Malaysian to get employed. However, it doesn't mean that migrant workers are not entitled to any job, because in Malaysia, migrant workers are entitled to work in 7 sectors. Another issue is I can say that limited access to the healthcare, where migrant workers might have difficulties to go for to get a treatment due to financial constraint and language barrier. Some of them might not be able to speak English or bahasa or bahasa Melayu in Malaysia. And there are also cases that some of the foreign workers have been discriminated. Some clinic or hospital have turned down their application to get the treatment there, and some of them doesn't have the legal document that might what you call it, put a difficult situation for them to get the healthcare services. Another issue is regarding there are cases of employers keep or hold their passport for safekeeping. However, this situation expose migrant workers to be arrested if being stopped by authorities, for example, police or immigration, because when they don't have a passport, their movement is limited within the compound. I mean, from their home to the workplace. And other issues is really unpaid wages by employers when they claim they have suffered big losses during COVID-19 pandemic. In this situation, they try not to pay their foreign workers, and this definitely gives huge impact to migrant workers to survive in Malaysia. Next slide. So some of initiatives that are taken by Malaysia government. First, government through in Ministry of Human Resources through Manpower Department, we have set up what we call monitor to and analyze report pertaining to retrenchment, temporary and voluntary layoff, salary reduction. So they can all the complaint will be investigated. And then for those migrant workers, we have what we call a redeployment services, where migrant workers that have been terminated, for example, in company A in construction sector, they can be transferred to work in company B, but in the same sector. Okay, the third initiative taken by the government of Malaysia, in order to keep the migrant workers or to appeal to the employees not to terminate the foreign workers, government have given what we call a 25% discount on levy payment for employees that employ foreign workers. The next step is to freeze the new intake of foreign workers till the end of this year. This is to ensure that those migrant workers or foreign workers in Malaysia, they doesn't have the job, they have the opportunity to apply for the job, instead of us hiring the new foreign workers from other countries. And to control the spread of COVID-19, government has made it compulsory health screening for all workers, including, I mean, both local and foreign workers. The cost will be borne by the employer. Next. So, as I mentioned mentioned in the slide before, there are major challenges when talking about on how to what you call it, to tackle this COVID-19 pandemic. For example, at the beginning of this COVID-19 pandemic, the government have quite difficult to get the cooperation from migrant workers to obey what you call the SOP from Ministry of Health, because there are perception among the migrant workers that they might be arrested if going for the swab test. Yeah? Another challenge is difficulties in obtaining what you call the report regarding retrenchment of migrant workers, as employers do not provide the detail if being asked. So the data that we have now is those employees that come forward to report how many staff that they have been terminated due to the the slowdown of business. And there are also misperception from NGOs. I mean, not all, a few of NGOs here. Government they take the perception is they think government move or to apprehend illegal workers, even though the main objective is to control the movement of people from spreading the COVID-19 virus. Because when Singapore have many cases involving foreign workers, Malaysia also try to take the same initiative to control the spread among the migrant workers. But that's the idea, and of course for those who are undocumented, they will be separated and they will be sent to the camp to test for the COVID-19 test. Another challenge for Malaysia that we have actually limited number of staff from manpower department to conduct inspection at the workplace. To in terms of, for example, to determine whether the wages are well paid to the employees, and to inspect the living condition, and also to monitor the contract employment, whether the employer obey with the contract that have been signed between them and the employees. And finally, the challenge is restricted movement of our enforcement officers to investigate cases, especially during the movement control order. This happened from the month of March till July this year. Okay, any more? Okay, I think that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Zakaria. You actually spent less than 15 minutes. I like to thank you for very honest provision of migrant workers landscape in Malaysia, problems they are facing, including discrimination that you mentioned. I think, as I said, a very honest picture that you paint there. Thanks as well for sharing with us, the challenges that the Malaysian government are currently facing. I think what you mentioned is actually shared by some other countries as well, including Thailand. My own. The question of balancing the attempt to contain the pandemic and respect and protection of the rights and welfare of migrant workers. This is a rather challenging issue that I think we will continue to discuss about. I hope you will stay with us until the end of the session to accommodate, to entertain some questions that we are now receiving from participants. So I'll be moving to our next speaker, Yuyun, who is, as I already introduced, the representative of Indonesia to the AICHR. Yuyun, please, it's your turn.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for having me here in this online forum. It's very timely right now to discuss about regional policies related to migrant workers, limitation and challenges during the pandemic. Next slide, please. In couple of months during the COVID-19, I engaged with number of civil society as well as the migrant workers through online discussion. Some of the organization come up with the reports, and these are some of the experiences of migrant workers during COVID-19. In the destination country, in the country of origin, and in the transit, the process of moving from destination country to the country of origin. So I do not want to read all, but because it's so small. but you may want to find out more about the experiences of migrant workers, including the unemployment mentioned earlier by the previous speakers, as well as suffered from the economic downturn from the COVID-19. Next slide, please. But I think the most important thing to be discussed here is how ASEAN, as a regional organization, respond to the issue of migrant workers. But before that, I would like to list here a number of responses from ASEAN in terms of COVID-19 in the last perhaps more than 8 months, because initially ASEAN already responded number of issues since December 2019. So ASEAN has shifted from the whole of government approach in relation to COVID-19 into the whole of ASEAN community approach. It means all three communities are expected to contribute something to contain the COVID-19, as well as to provide action in relation to mitigating the impact of COVID-19. Currently, ASEAN is discussing the comprehensive recovery framework, which aim to be holistic, comprehensive, inclusive, and practical. It is planned that the submission of the framework and the adoption of the framework will be done in the 36th ASEAN Summit, and then the action plan will be submitted and will be adopted in the next summit. So next summit will be in November, and then the other one, the 37, will be in either usually April or May 2021. ASEAN also established ASEAN Coordinating Council Working Group on Public Health Emergency that has been meeting frequently. I'm not sure how frequent they are, but I continue to hear that they develop a lot of guidelines, a lot of possible cooperation among member states in ASEAN. Also, ASEAN come up with the COVID-19 response fund. They are now talking about a number of contribution that each country can provide, as well as how dialogue partners can contribute to this kind of funds. ASEAN also come up with the regional reserve medical supplies for public health emergencies, standard of operation for public health emergencies. There's a new center that established, which called ASEAN Center for Public Emergencies and Emerging Disease. There is also rapid assessment on the impact of COVID-19 to the ASEAN population. A number of statements, joint statement, press statement, a declaration in relation to COVID-19. One of the two things that I think relevant to this our discussion today is the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Social Welfare Development on mitigating the impact of COVID-19 for vulnerable groups in ASEAN, and the ASEAN joint statement of labor ministers in response to the impact of COVID-19 on labor and employment. Next, please. So I would like to highlight the latest one, the joint statement of the labor ministers that address issues that deals with migrant workers. I think Director Akaltara also mentioned about a suggestion from the Philippines for ASEAN to provide the compensation. ASEAN member state to provide compensation, social assistance, as well as the unemployment benefit for those who have laid out because of COVID-19. So it has been approved and agreed by labor ministers. I think at the level of commitment is already there. And the other cooperation that mentioned in the document is to help migrant workers in the third countries. So for instance, like in Hong Kong or in Saudi Arabia and other countries. So countries that have consulate or embassies will be able to help all ASEAN citizens migrant workers, especially to return home if they want. And next, please. For the AICHR come up with the press statement highlighting the migrant workers as vulnerable group that need to be prioritized in the efforts of government to address COVID-19. The statement from the MMSWD, or the ASEAN Minister on Social Welfare Development, highlighted that migrant workers are considered as vulnerable groups, and agreed that all ASEAN member states to provide access to all essential goods and services to safeguard the well-being and livelihood of migrant workers, as well as to identify and respond child protection and gender-based violence against migrant workers during COVID-19, as well as to develop comprehensive and integrated post-pandemic recovery, especially for the migrant workers. Next, please. In terms of the right of migrant work, the right of health to the health of migrant workers, which I would like to highlight more, because I think during the pandemic there are two fundamental rights that are very important here: is right to life and as well as right to health, which without these two rights, other freedoms or other right cannot be fulfilled. As mentioned earlier by Achan Sripapa, that the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration mentioned about the right of migrant workers are human rights. That's in Article 4. And the right to health in the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, highlighting three focus areas, which is the right to medical care and necessary social services, and then basic affordable healthcare services and medical facilities, and social aspect of the right to health. It means each government of ASEAN need to reduce stigma, as well as uh, uh, do not discriminate in providing right to health or fulfilling the right to health. 2017 ASEAN Consensus also mentioned about the right to health of migrant workers, asking sending state to be responsible to ensure migrant workers meet the health requirements of the receiving states in Article 25, and also for the receiving states are responsible to provide adequate information concerning the occupational safety and health measures, clear employment terms and condition, and fair treatment to migrant workers in respect to, and among others, occupational safety and health protection, and access to adequate medical and health care in Article of 41. The ASEAN post 2015 Health Development Agenda, or of the Senior Official Meeting on Health, mentioned about the right of the right to health of migrant workers. Very specific. Um, the document also mentioned about the aim of coming up with a guideline, as well as the policy on health coverage for documented migrants. So it means that the issue of the health of migrant workers are the concerns of different sectoral bodies and organs in ASEAN, not only the ACMW or the Ministry of Labor, but also AICHR, as well as the Ministry of Health. Next, please. So I'm also asked to talk about limitation and challenges, how these policies available already to address COVID-19, as well as the right to health and the right of migrant workers, have limitation and challenges. The first one is the lack of standardization due to different national health system in different countries of ASEAN. Um, and there is no system that incorporate the need of migrant workers in health financing, policy planning, etc., etc. And there is no portable universal health coverage for migrant workers. I know there has been number of discussion under ACMW in relation to develop the regional portable health coverage, universal health coverage for migrant workers. I think the lead of this activity is Thailand. There was a question about who will pay the for the services, whether the migrant workers, the agent, or the government, and how to include this kind of element into the MOU, or bilateral MOU or multilateral MOU among the relevant countries, providing the opportunity for migrant workers to migrate and to work. And there is also the absence of industrial relationship, especially those who are working at domestic work. The relationship is rather informal, so not necessarily formal. So this kind of right of the migrant workers to access healthcare is not there. The previous speaker from Malaysia also already mentioned about uh, 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 lack of access for migrant workers to healthcare, but perhaps behind that also because there is no industrial relationship between the workers and the employers. Data collection is another problem to deal with. I think we have seen how the issue of migrant workers during COVID-19 has been overwhelming so far. One of them is also lack of data provided for us. So in the last summit, ASEAN talked about travel bubbles. It could be good and it could be bad because it may lead to economic isolation. Only for those who are coming from green zones can travel around, but not from red zones. And countries sending countries usually so far coming from the red zone. So the movement of human or people for the purpose of migrant workers or working is not yet facilitated during the COVID-19 situation. Next, please. I have only three more minutes. Ways to better protection of migrant workers. ASEAN need to develop portable universal health coverage for in migration management, and then to include migrant workers' health scheme in the health emergency plan, as well as in the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Plan. So we still have time until November to provide some of the inputs. Perhaps this is something that many people would like to consider to address the need of migrant workers' health into the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Plan. And during the so this is my last point. During the COVID-19, we also hear that uh, the discourse of migrants have becoming negative rather than positive because the characteristic of the virus is deal with the humans movement. So those who are not coming from the region, those who are not coming from the village, those who are not coming from our community, considered as virus carriers. So this also happened to migrants, including migrant workers, refugees, and others. So one way to better protection for migrant workers to change the narrative as early as possible to correct the wrong understanding about migrant workers as the virus carrier, and then that should be done as early as possible. And thank you very much.
So much, Yun, very, very, very punctual and very systematic outlines of the impacts. Yeah, again, you're giving us a overall picture at regional level. Very, very informative and systematic, as I said. I like to pick up two things there. One is about actually so far look like ASEAN leaders been trying to respond to the COVID-19. Of course, for ASEAN people. But in the same time, when the documents refer to national law, the term in accordance with laws, regulations, and policies of the ASEAN member states. I think that's one of the problem which prevent ASEAN to come up with what you call a regional, standardization of treatment of migrant workers. The second one, which I think is also important, the ways forward that you just mentioned at the end of your presentation. In fact, Thailand. By the time that was some years ago, I recall I was helping them with doing some research about the protection of the rights of migrant workers in ASEAN. And the Legal Reform Commission, together with the Ministry of Labor of Thailand, they came up with a document that they call the ASEAN Agreement on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers. Unfortunately, because of the coup d'etat, the legal reform commissioners were completely, removed. They were all removed from their positions, and they could not further their advocacy. So I would be very happy. We would be very happy, to share with Aisha that particular document because it's already ready, and we actually, I think we presented in two events. One at the ASEAN Regional Forum. It was in Malaysia. So that was in 2015, and then another one in front of some ASEAN officers. So definitely, please remind me. We'd be very happy to share with Aisha. In case Aisha wants to pursue. Thank you so much. Now we come to our reactor, Brema. Brema, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Sri Papa, and thank you to Mr. Akaltara, Dr. Zaki, and Ms. Yuyun. As a reactor, I have a few points that I would raise. Much of it is in agreement to all that you all have shared, but also because of moderator Dr. Sri Papa hoping to hear a little bit about Singapore, I'll just do a quick snapshot on Singapore because as Marwa, we also are very concerned alongside many of the civil society actors and civil society individual members who have been really on the ground working quite hard on this issue related to migrant workers. So just a quick snapshot, we have about 940,000 workers on work permits considered migrant workers, of whom about 252,000 are foreign domestic workers. Majority are Filipinos, and the other group, the other lot would be Indonesian workers. Under those who work in the construction sector, we have about 351,800. Most of them are from Bangladesh. And this whole thing about the pandemic and the COVID-19 burst upon Singapore, when we are talking about the migrant workers, primarily because of the kind of dwellings in which they were living. Many of them, almost about 300,000, were housed in dormitories, where many of them were inside one about 10 to 15. Within one cubicle and sharing toilet facilities, as well as a limited access to showers, etc., because everyone has to queue up and on rotation. And that doesn't mean that everyone lives in the dorm. They also live off-center outside of the dorms in various dwellings. So information access, access to PPE, personal protection equipment, and also any form of reassurance. We were all on the behind. We were running after the problem as it was in most other countries. But what has happened is, as Dr. Sri Papa also has said, is 90% of the infections have come because of the proximity in which the migrant workers are living. But this is not really the fundamental problem. What is good about Singapore is that most of them have been COVID tested, most of them have access to hospitalization, treatment, etc. But what we are saying, and this is my response listening to all of the discussions, plus a lot of the discussions that are outside and going on apart from this forum, is that this is not, the COVID-19 has really highlighted, putting it in bright lights for us, what migrant workers are going through. And I think going forward, we have to really take apart what we really need to do in terms of the fundamentals. And as we have all agreed on, there are the human rights principles, there are documents, the Human Rights Declaration, the ASEAN Charter. We have the documents, and as both Dr. Zaki and Mr. Alankantra has already said, we have a problem of implementation and enforcement. It's a governance issue, but underpinning the governance, the implementation, and the efficiency of working out on the work plans is, I think, the mindset that we have. And the mindset problem is we need to start recognizing migrant workers as employees, that they are doing a job in all our countries, and therefore everything that towards the end that Ms. Yuyun has brought up, universal health coverage, definite contractual terms on employment, work hours, salaries, overtime, insurance schemes, social protection, etc., must be detailed and must be seen through, enforced, governed, and where it fails, justice has to step in. Compensation and measures to seek what has gone on have to be put into place. What we are seeing, and this is coming across all the civil society actors in many of the countries, there's a bit of chipping away on one corner and another thing bursts, and then we do not have enough human resources, as Dr. Zaki very kindly put it down, that there are not enough human resources. So if we have a percentage of workers coming from other countries, or even from the rural area migrating to city centers looking for work, definitely the ministries involved in all of these assuring that employment terms are met, well-being of employees are taken into account, that it is a transactionary experience. You are giving us work, we take care of you as an employee. It is a fundamental, and I hope it comes up as a strong consideration at the summit that Ms. Yuyun has talked about, that we need to start recognizing them as employees and put in the human resources into the ministries to actually function efficiently, to KPIs, to on-the-ground work, to ensure that migrant workers are given the right terms as an employee within any country. Most of our countries have, Malaysia's, Dr. Zaki said it's about 15%. Some of our countries across the 10 ASEAN countries, we have varying percentages of migrant workers working in our countries. And we have the documents, we have the instruments. What is the biggest gap would be the implementation, as well as the governance on the implementation. And as Ms. Yuyun and Dr. Sri Papa have both stated it again, and I reiterate, the standardization of the processes. I think this is the first part that I would like to put forward. The second part that I would like to say is our definition of migrant workers. Most of our countries have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and their families. But I think it is crucial to look into the definition of migrant workers, and under Article 2, all the terms of different forms of migrant workers are listed there. People who even come for short term, people, even our own citizens who are sent to another country for short term contracts because we are into regionalization and also globalization. I think it is worth reconsidering in developing new normal, whatever we mean by new normal, approaches, the lessons learned from the pandemic, to recognize that there are different types of migrant workers within one's country, as well as our citizens going to other countries. I think we are talking about protection of both citizens as well as migrant workers, and therefore our definition of migrant workers needs to become much wider in the longer term, in the midterm to longer term. That's my second point. The third one that I would like to put forward, we have 10 million, according to ILO's data, 10 million migrant workers under the documented scheme in the 10 countries that we have. That is quite a large number, and 50% of them are women. And we have data research papers on COVID-19 and the impact on female migrant workers. And many of them, I think sometimes we run the risk of overlooking what has happened to quite a number of the female migrant workers. Case in point, for example, under the lockdowns, many domestic workers were also locked down in the family home. That means all family members were in the home. What kind of hours were they onto? And who were they trying to please? If there are 5 family members, what were all the tasks they were asked to do? Were they harassed? Was there any form of violence? These are still unknowns, and I think all these are important things that we have to look at. If 50% of the migrant workers in the 10 ASEAN countries happen to be women. The third point that I would like to raise, which is a known, and I think Ms. Yu Yun showed us in her second slide, the environment that they work in, environment of work. We have already heard from civil society, and I listened to Migrant Forum Asia giving a very good account to business and human rights in a podcast. And the key word that William Goyce used, and I think it's a crucial word, exponential increases in not meeting the terms of employment. That is non-payment of wages, sudden dismissal, sorry, you have to take care of yourself, and some abuse, etc., etc. This is in some countries, for example, Singapore, Malaysia, despite government giving reductions in levy payments, despite governments giving assistance to companies to cope with the situation, then how is it that some of that money in some cases did not reach the migrant worker? Then what is the migrant worker supposed to live on? So that is one condition. Environment of dwelling space and basic needs. Ms. Yu Yun brought it up, I'm emphasizing it. Food. We have many services in Singapore, and I've seen it also in Malaysia, where the community, this is the saving grace in all our countries when the pandemic is concerned, people running around despite fearing COVID-19, carrying bags, giving it to people, making sure the vulnerable groups, whether they are citizens or migrant workers, have food, have access to all of this. I think that is something beautiful, but I think we also have to prepare for the next round when the next zoonotic disease comes along and we face another pandemic, that these communities' basic essentials, we have an approach. We have the COVID Trust Fund, we have emergency approaches, but we need to streamline it to having proper measures that we can roll out when it comes to meeting people's basic needs, access to food, access to running water, access to hygiene conditions, access to physical distancing from one another. And we face that huge challenge. We are still facing it in Singapore because we are very small. And how far apart can we have migrant workers living from each other, and where to have the new housing approach for the short term. Mid-term, we are working towards it, but I think there are lessons to be learned from the Singapore experience so that other countries, especially, for example, I'm just sharing it, like Malaysia, which has got quite a number of undocumented workers. How are they living? What are their conditions? And how are we going to ensure that they are protected so that the rest of the citizens are also protected from COVID-19? Environment of information. To what extent did the migrant workers get their information in their native languages for them to fully understand how to wear a mask, safe distancing, etc., etc.? I think these are, if we have been having them in our community for about 3 to 4 decades, definitely by now we should have the plethora of linguistic experts and the information that we can change quite quickly to share with the community. Environment of sustainability. This is the entrepreneurial and enterprises. We are into SDG mode, and I think sustainability when it comes to SDG Goal 5, especially Goal 8, which relates to work conditions, I think we need to bring back all the measures and the lessons learned to meeting SDG goals, the targets that we have an annual report on. I looked at the annual report. All the ASEAN countries, majority of us did not function well on safety and well-being of workers, occupational safety and well-being, which is, I think, target 8.8 under the SDGs. And I think these are things that we can improve upon. Environment of survivability. My last point on this area is that I think we really got to dive down and start learning from it to fix it. I think we cannot forget that migrant workers, documented, undocumented, and even some refugees who are working as undocumented migrant workers, or some with an identity that is given to them by the UNHCR, all of them have high resilience when it comes to survivability, and we need to appreciate that. Nevertheless, we need to also know, while a citizen with family and everyone around them some are psychologically impacted, we also have to make sure that their mental well-being is taken care of. In Singapore, we have had a few incidents where some migrant workers were standing on the ledge and had to be convinced not to jump off, but to come back into the room. And I think COVID, we do not know the full extent of how COVID impacts us short-term, medium-term to long-term, and how badly it can really put a huge mark of depression on us. And if they do not have access to communicate with their families, etc., how many of us can really give that time? So access route to keeping up an emotional touch base, I think, is important. And I think most of us touched on it and didn't touch on it in a systemic manner, did not have enough human resources to give to the migrant workers. And I am almost ending, Dr. Sri Papa. I looked through certain things that I think are important for us to bear in mind, basing on what Ms. Yu Yun has said about the summits, and this is coming up. ASEAN has had SARS. ASEAN still has tuberculosis, measles, and now we have COVID-19. And I looked up Lancet. In Lancet, January 25th, 2011, there's a huge article, a research paper written where it says the region will contain diverse zoonotic and vector-borne pathogens as a region with high density and proximity and high mobility of human beings. This will continue. Thirdly, as a region with ecological factors that allow rapid pathogen mutation and host adaptation, there are measures that as a group of 670 million people, including the migrant workers, we need to develop our we need to work on our structures, our instruments, and our mechanisms that we have to ensure that implementation takes place with clear targets, and the targets are also, we can borrow a lot of it. Nationally, it's already being done through SDG targets to make it easier for all of us. The very last point, sorry, is in this whole rethinking, we need to see migrant workers as essential workers. But I take the point that Dr. Zaki put forward, that with high unemployment of citizens and perhaps some resentment by citizens, I think a lot of work also has to go back to employers to make sure that the first base of employability is given to citizens. But if for that to happen, we have to make sure that policies and incentives are correct, whereby employers have to make sure that they give their employment to citizens than the migrant workers. Otherwise, we will all be known sooner or later of being destination spots for cheap labor by migrant workers, and they're not handling them well under normal situations and in an abnormal situation like a pandemic. I think that's the core to the fundamental principles of human rights. If we allow people to come into our country to work for our well-being, then we also have to give them fair employment terms and ensure that they get the fair employment terms. And we have the instruments. So with that, I would say, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Spend 20 minutes to actually sharing with us the picture on the ground. Not only in Singapore, but I think you mentioned many things which are really, for all of us, provide food for thought. I think maybe just to pick up on, as usual, a few things. First of all, streamlining in order to meet people's basic needs. And by people's basic needs here, I refer to whoever they are. Those who are in our territory, making use of existing framework, including the SDG that all member states of ASEAN have committed to at international level, so not only at regional level. The second one that I think it's what we heard, from different speakers. One thing that I feel that this is part of the problem, and that is distinction, the clear distinction between nationals and non-nationals. Distinction between documented and undocumented migrant workers. So you might notice in the presentation of Yuyun, for example, ASEAN documents tend to refer to documented migrant workers. But we know, for example, in Thailand, out of 4 to 5 days, no accurate statistic here. But according to estimation of academics, we believe there are around 4 to 5 migrant workers in Thailand, and less than 2 million actually register. So you can imagine how many of them are undocumented. So this clear distinction actually always lead to discrimination and not unequal treatment. The third one that I think is also extremely important, the proximity, shareable boundaries, and of course, connectivity. You imagine, ASEAN has been always during the past almost 20 years talking about connectivity, and this connectivity has both positive and negative impacts. One of the things that I always talk about, which is actually how ASEAN is connecting to the people and how people to people are connected. Um, Maybe the last thing that at least a few of you have picked up, which is about roles and responsibilities of employers. I think it's extremely, again, extremely crucial because roles and responsibilities of employers. I think in a way, and this is just in a way, depend on the actually on many things, including capacity of the governments to hold them accountable, to monitor. Um, uh, Dr. Zakaria earlier mentioned about the lack of human resources, inadequate human resources, which has impact on the issue of accountability in our region as well. I think those are some of the things, not everything, some of the things that I just want to highlight from Brema and other speakers. We are now open to further discussions, and don't forget that at the very beginning, I already mentioned that one of the objectives, because the working group has been driving, for effective ASEAN human rights regime. So of course, we want to hear how making use of the issue of migrant workers, to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the existing human rights regime in ASEAN, and in order for us to actually put our heads, our brain together, how to support our existing regional human rights mechanism to better promote and protect the rights of every single people, including of course migrant workers. I saw from um, the message that we have 4 questions from the comment section. Paula, what do we do with the questions, because I don't see the question myself? Are you sharing the questions? Okay. So the question from Danilo Lazerna to Director Akaltara, and I saw the response. Unfortunately, Director Akaltara could not stay on with us, but he actually responded to the question brought up by Miss or Mr. I'm not quite sure, Danilo Lazerna already, about banning of health professionals from leaving the country for overseas employment. And I think some of us see his answer in the chat box, that about observation about the banning of healthcare workers, and he mentioned, I think for the benefit of other audience, healthcare workers are put on a mission critical skills list. They are not banned. The listing seeks to prioritize the healthcare system needs of the country, and it's temporarily. And he underlined the term temporarily there in nature. It is also helpful to note that the listing is not absolute, as there are exemptions. So not only temporarily, but also exemptions. Continuing work is being done by a high-level interagency task force to further relax the listing. So this is the answer from Director um, before he left, the panel. Yes. So you want to address this one or the next one? Because there is another question that I just saw but now disappear. So another question from Henry Rogers that he said, we have received reports from wage theft committed against migrant workers since the start of COVID-19 pandemic. Do you have information on the extent of wage theft in? Oh wow. I'm not quite sure who is going to deal with this particular and very specific question from Henry Rogers. Brema, I saw hand from Yuyun. Yuyun, you wanted to address the previous question, this question.
I want to
Before I
address
go to Brema.
your question in relation to the role of human rights mechanism in relation.
Oh, okay. Could you keep it for a while? Okay, Brema, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sripapa. In answer to Mr. Henry, I cannot answer totally for the ASEAN region, but yes, there are many cases of wages that were not paid to workers, and even during lockdown, some of them were illegally asked to work, all hidden, and in some countries and in some places under the staggered approach to unlocking the lockdown, some of them were asked to work for very small sums. So there are various levels. The CSOs are documenting the cases. It is up on the website. I think academically, this has to be pieced together so that we know to what extent there's a big hole in the amount of money that they did not receive, because some of them, just to add on to this very quickly, some of them sent their money home, and in a lockdown there was no money also going home. In some cases, the home was trying to send money to the workers because they were also without money. So we do not have a good situation, and when the cases are there, they are really bad. So what I didn't say earlier is what saved a lot of this, because no government person can be on the ground. It is the community and the civil society that has been doing a lot of patchwork. And I think that's the beautiful part that we must celebrate, but it doesn't mean that we need to systemize our approaches. That's all I can say. At the ASEAN level, I think all this will come up under the ACM, the ASEAN Labour Ministers and the ASEAN Committee on Labour. They need to raise all this and talk about systemizing. This is what I can share, unless Dr. Zakaria might have something more. I wouldn't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wanting to ask Dr. Zakaria as well. Of course, as we heard quite a lot, I can share as well about Thailand, because even before pandemic, we have been documenting the the lack of, not lack of payment, but that the employers didn't pay the wage to the workers. And I myself, I have even visited some police stations every single 15 days, because usually workers are paid every 15 days. So at the middle of the month, at the end of the month, if you visit the police stations, you see that police stations, detention center are packed by migrant workers, only because the employers report to the police, especially which come to undocumented migrant workers. So you see how sad the situation is. That was before pandemic, and of course during the pandemic, the situation is even worse. I guess our colleague from Malaysia, as government official, I hope you are monitoring this as well in the case of Malaysia.
Okay, thank you, Doctor, moderator. From Malaysian perspective, actually, all the salary should be paid through bank account. And they have been stated in our act and every employer have to follow that procedure. When I read this question, actually it do happen in Malaysia, but when we're talking about what we call that wage theft, right? I think it's happened rampantly among undocumented migrant workers. Okay, because the employer they manipulate. They know these employees rather have legal to work legally in Malaysia, and they opt to pay by cash. And there are cases that these undocumented migrant workers being paid less than what they are supposed to get. You know, they will cite that you will take long leave, you don't perform very well. I already paid for your, like for your house. This my employer, some more employers use lame excuses in order, to pay less. Actually, we did implement we call it minimum wage of 1,200 in 55 cities in Malaysia. It cover around 80% of the employees. Most, I think these cases happen in Malaysia heavily involved among undocumented, and we have reported to our labor department uh, to have more what you call that inspection in the near future. Now government of Malaysia is trying to increase the number of a labor inspectorate, because the number that we have having right now is quite few, only 300 plus. To monitor all over country is a huge task. That's why we already applied to our public service department to increase the number of labor inspectorate, and hopefully these issues can be tackled comprehensively. Thank you.
Thank you. Yuyun, I hope you don't mind that I be giving you the last words about the roles of AICHR. We deal with two other questions, Paula. Question to ASEAN governments. What are the ASEAN governments doing to address the problem of wage theft? Well, I think Henry, you got a kind of, an answer from our colleague from Malaysia, who is sitting there, in Malaysian government, and of course, I would not be able to address this because I hardly talk to Ministry of Labor in Thailand. It's quite difficult, but it's, as I mentioned, and Brima have mentioned as well, and of course, Dr. Zakari have mentioned earlier about the rules of employers, responsibilities, and by responsibility, it's not just about legal responsibility, but also moral responsibilities here, and monitoring system of the government, I think. Next question from Daisy Marie Subnet. How are the undocumented migrant workers being processed, especially if they were not able to renew their legal documents during this pandemic? Brima, Dr. Zakaria, or Yuyun, do you have anything to share based on, of course, your own country? I Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
Brema,
Just
briefly, yeah.
for me, just to share, I think because I've written a paper about Malaysia, maybe there is a process that Malaysia put through, but I think Dr. Zakaria can give the details, I think, compared to this. But overall, what has happened also in some of the countries is that there's a stay order on the work permit. If it has lapsed, you should be renewing it, and you are under lockdown. There's a stay order, and when it's lifted, your employer can put back that that this person is needed for the employment, and it can be renewed. In countries where it's not computerized, Singapore is computerized, very much so. I think the process is a little bit more will take a longer time. But that is all that I wish to say on this. Thank you.
Dr. Zakaria, you like to add on this particular
Yeah.
issue, please?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Moderator. In Malaysia, actually, it's our when we mention about undocumented, they are at first place they are entering Malaysia without we call it proper document. So when the government during the COVID-19 pandemic, what the government of Malaysia trying to do is to reduce this type of undocumented workers. That's why in March and April, those who doesn't have the proper document, they have been separated. They have been we call it in certain camp in Malaysia. They have to take the swab test, and those who are negative, okay, negative. The government of Malaysia is work very closely with the embassies to deport them back. But those who are positive, they are been sending to our quarantine in Serdang, where they are given all the what we call the necessary help, the necessary we call medicine in order for them to recover from this COVID-19. Of course, they are negative and positive when you are talking about this. But the main intention of the government of Malaysia during that time, because actually when we mention about undocumented, these are the group that have been heavily abused. And what we call the term is forced labor. That happened in Malaysia. In some companies, they are using this undocumented to suppress them to work longer with minimum wage. That the government of Malaysia, we are trying hard to stop this we call practices. It is unlawful. It's inhumanitarian to do that. That's why we trying to reduce the number of undocumented and those who have been, I mean, we call it deported. The workers doesn't have to pay. We are working with the embassy, so they are deported back to their countries, and
We cannot hear you. Uh, Paula, I'm not quite sure.
Connection.
Yeah,
sorry for the interruption.
yeah. I think the connection was cut. Could you
Yeah,
please repeat what you previously said?
yeah. Okay, I just repeat the last sentence. I mean, what we try to do, we try to help these undocumented migrant workers to go back to their country, okay, with the help of respective embassies, okay. And then this it also will we tackle the issue of forced labor that happen in some sectors in Malaysia. I think that from what I can share from the government perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Zakaria. I think what you mentioned is very important. Maybe just like to add, from at least in the case of Thailand, Desi, that I think when we talk about undocumented migrant workers, we are looking at two different situations here. One is migrant worker migrant workers who have never registered and they remain undocumented since their entry into the country. The second one is actually registered or documented migrant workers whose their registration ended maybe before or during COVID-19. I guess your question is about the second group of migrant workers. At least in the case of Thailand, the government announced actually asking them uh, to ex- to extend their registration with I think without charge, as far as I recall, during the pandemic time. So you can see that actually with political will, the government could do quite a lot in order to help migrant workers. One of the things that I see more and more, not only in Thailand, is actually how to make sure that the registration scheme is a facilitating process, not a restricting process. Because until now, registration is about restrictions. It with high charge, and with a rather long process that the migrant workers will have to go through. So I just want to you to share this with Dr. Zakaria as well, how to make registration or documentation of migrant workers a facilitated one. Thank you. I think it's now time for Yuyun. Especially when it comes to the rules of regional human rights mechanism. But just want to go back to Dr. Zakaria a bit. I know that you are working at the Human Resource Ministry and maybe working, but I think what you presented now. You are so attached to human rights language. So I want to know, because we are now at the end of this particular session, we are now focusing on the rules, how to strengthen the protection of the AICHR and of course also ACWC. As a government official yourself, how you foresee their roles, and especially the complementary roles of the regional human rights mechanism to the existing national organizations dealing with migrant workers. You have any ideas, your expectations, Dr. Zakaria?
Come again, Mr. Moderator. Come again
Oh,
about the question.
oh, sorry. I was asking you about.
Because,
Can I? Did you hear my question earlier?
not so, because we have problem with the internet.
Okay. All right.
Right? Yeah.
All right. I'll be repeating my question to you before
Yeah.
I give final words to Yuyun. My question was, as someone sitting in government agency, at high rank position, in fact, and you have been using what I call, human rights language. So I wonder, what you are expecting, from the ASEAN, human rights mechanism like AICHR, especially when it comes to the protection of the rights of migrant workers here.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you so much for that question. Of course, when we are talking about either local, international, migrant, undocumented, or documented, all of us are people. Okay, we are human. Of course, some people make mistake. Some have, even though they are undocumented, I believe some of them have been manipulated. They have been tricked by the agent, by some sectors. That what happened in Malaysia, and I think it also happen in some other state. So my hope, when we have this type of discussion, this we call that ASEAN on migrant workers, I believe we have to strengthen our collaboration, and we have to work. We call that cross-sectoral bodies. We have to come up when we have the what we call that the declaration. We need to revise it again and again, and we need to improve, and we need to strengthen our cooperation, even strengthen the languages. Not just we have to use the word like urge, instead of some tone down words. We need to stress on some issues. Okay, because I believe every human have dignity, and we need to respect them, and we need to treat them with dignity. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll be trying to have you every single forum that we have. Because not I have to share with you one thing. I was sitting in Aisha myself, and then when we were, drafting the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, a Malaysian representative from Labor Ministry, always, was always against the inclusion of the rights of migrant workers in the declaration. I'm glad that that position has changed, and you are a very human rights based person. Thank you so much indeed, Dr. Sakari.
Okay. I just want to add. In the last session with our ALM, we have accept the term migrant workers in the declaration. So when we try to our best, we try our best to accept that we need to respect each other. And like I mentioned earlier, even the migrant workers, they are the one also that contribute a lot to our economic development. I think it's Singapore to have the same experience with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I always say that migrant workers are needed but not wanted. So I'll be very happy that they are needed and wanted. Thank you.
Yeah.
Brema want to say something about 3Ds? Just maybe
Thank you
1 minute.
so much. Yeah, thank you so much for letting me. The 3D, sorry, Dr. Zakaria, before you disappear, I wanted to put that in, about demanding, difficult, and all that. I think most of us are shifting away, if I may just put that to you from that, because then we label the work and the worker. And it also prevents others from coming to it. Even ILO, I think, is shifting away from that phrase. So maybe at the ALM, that will be another good way if you've already come up to migrant worker, and also to drop mates. If you can influence my dear country, Singapore, to drop the word mate, I will be
Thank
so
you.
happy.
That's
Thank you.
that's a
Thank
very
you.
important point. Actually, the way we frame. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
Yuyun,
Okay.
human rights bodies, Aisha, in your case.
All right. So last year we have actually agreed on activities in relation to migrant workers as well as right to health, which one of the session will talk about the right of migrant workers on health. So on the workshop in relation to migrant workers, we would like to harmonize between the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration Article 4 as well, and then with the ASEAN Consensus, because the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration is like umbrella statement. The right of migrant workers are human rights. The Article 4, it talk about elderly migrant workers, person with disabilities, women, children are part of human rights. No elaboration about what kind of rights. So, but that's actually very good in many ways. But at the same time, the ASEAN Consensus talk about the state obligation of sending state and receiving state, and then human rights of the migrant workers. The fact that number of the articles in the ASEAN Consensus linked to the condition to the countries, that's something else. But how to bring these two together to ensure the right of migrant workers, and we would like to come up with the some kind of recommendation for member state and the sectoral bodies on how to respect right of migrant workers, bringing these two documents together. And also because the mandate of AICHR is to promote the implementation of the ASEAN instruments in relation to human rights. At the same time, the ACWC had come up with the ASEAN Declaration on children in the context of migration. So again, if we put these three documents together, we would like to see further some kind of guideline. AICHR doesn't like the word guideline, but perhaps some recommendations, policy recommendation, basically to provide the advices for governments as well as for ASEAN sectoral bodies, how to centralize the human rights in migrant workers. And so so we couldn't do that last year because we lack of time. The discussion of the concept note took a little bit time, but finally already agreed. Now with the COVID-19, we should make it online. So this something that AICHR Indonesia will be organizing on behalf of AICHR. And the other one is on the right to health. Again, for organizing this right to health workshop, focusing on universal health coverage, and we'll be looking at different kind of documents of ASEAN consensus. ASEAN consensus is one, ASEAN Human Rights Declaration is another, and then the plan of action of the ASEAN Minister on Health also will be taken into consideration. I have been consulting with some HD, Senior Official Meeting on Health and Development. They really need to be advised by AICHR in relation to the right of migrant workers. When we look at the document, actually they are looking for the output like the policy document as well as the guideline on how to respect the right of migrant workers in the context of regionalism. So these two activities will be organized online in until the end before the end of the year, and I hope with your I would like to expect your participation as well to guide us and to provide more inputs on how we can frame the right of migrant workers during pandemic or beyond the pandemic. But ACMW is aiming for portable universal health coverage for migrant workers, and this is something that perhaps we need to welcome and we need to support with our own mandates. Yeah, so I think a number of initiatives around ASEAN are there on migrant workers gradually. I think this is something that we did not see like 5 years ago, but now more and more institutions, bodies, organs in ASEAN uh, open more to the issue of migrant workers. And we need to use this and maximize this opportunity to protect migrant workers in the region.
Thank you so much, Yuyun. Maybe just like to summarize as recommendations from this particular panel based on our discussions and of course intervention from Yuyun as representative of not of AICHR but Indonesian AICHR representative here. I don't want you to have any problem. The first one, I think it's important when you mentioned about harmonization, of the ASEAN frameworks. By harmonization of existing ASEAN frameworks, we refer to, for example, ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, especially Article 4, the ASEAN Declaration on the Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Migrant Workers. And it's called the same with the ASEAN Consensus. And actually, there are a few other documents in ASEAN as well. So I think, reviewing and harmonizing this ASEAN framework is a very good proposal, including documents produced and adopted by ACWC and other bodies as well. The second one that I pick up, but I may use different term, which is about a kind of building synergy. By synergy, I am talking about building synergies between the existing ASEAN human rights regime, I mean ACWC and AICHR, with functional ASEAN bodies. You mentioned about different ASEAN functional bodies. Labor, social welfare, social development, maybe women, children as well. So in ASEAN, you got so many what I call functional bodies represented by different line ministries. So there's a need for synergy there among these bodies. That's the second one. The third one, the entry point. I think what you mentioned about universal health coverage is an important, entry point, and it's not just for me, it's not just universal health coverage, but also that you could put universal uh, uh, as adjective before many things. Universal education, for example, especially for the children of migrant workers, or even for the worker themselves come to vocational and skill, training. This should be made universal as well as an entry point. So, again, this is something that I think is important one. These are three things that I pick up from you. I would like to maybe to add two more things as recommendations, if for AICHR and ACWC to consider before you come up with any of the so-called guidelines that you mentioned. One recommendation I still recall. I think I shared this in different forums that in 2010, Aisha received a letter from the ASEAN Ministry of Health, ASEAN senior officials of health, asking for the view for the advice of AICHR, because one of the roles of AICHR is actually to give advisory opinions, to ASEAN functional bodies. So the question was whether or not mandatory HIV/AIDS testing, among migrant workers, especially for the purpose of registration, as a violation of their rights. I came up with a document already, in order for Aisha to give answer to the senior officials of health. But my document was not even, discussed, in Aisha. That was the first batch. I would be happy to share with you that document because this could be part of the advisory opinion to be given by Aisha. And of course, Dr. Zakaria, I think that would be a good practice. So if you have anything when it comes to human rights of migrant workers, you can also address Aisha for, of course, advisory opinion. The second one, the thematic studies. Aisha, both Aisha and ACWC have in your mandates and function to conduct thematic studies, and I think this is a prime time, especially if we want to ensure the respect and the protection of the rights of migrant workers. I think not only doing study, but based on documentations, especially being conducted, being collected by different NGOs. Aisha could come up with a very good thematic studies on the situation of the rights of migrant workers amidst COVID-19. So this is actually my recommendation from the working group for you to consider. With that, I wanted to finish at 11 a.m., but we are now 11:08, so 8 minutes delay. I hope you don't mind. I'd like to first of all thank our speakers. Thank you so much, Yuyun. Thank you so much, Dr. Zakaria. And thanks our speaker from the Philippines, Director Levison and Akaltara, who joined us earlier. Thanks for your very frank sharing, and I think very useful. I really appreciate. My thanks are extended to participants whom I don't see in on the screen. I'm not quite sure, Paula, if we have any way to have screenshot with speakers and participants. That would be nice, actually, if we could do it. I'm not very familiar with this new platform, but thank you so much for your kind participation and, of course, question from some of you. I like to also thank my team, working behind all kind of preparation that the secretary of the working group for an ASEAN Human Rights Mechanism, led by Paula and RP, to organize this particular forum. Thank you so much indeed, for all kind of preparation. As I actually, without you, it would not have been possible for us, to organize this. So again, thank you so much, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.